Welcome to lesson 6. Today we're going to be looking at our first lesson of functions. So what are functions and why do we use them? A function is a block of code that runs whenever it is called. And functions read data, which are also called parameters or arguments. Functions can also return data or execute a function such as print or input. And we mainly use functions to help organize programs and shorten programs. For example, if there's a function that you want to repeat multiple times in your program, but you want it to be called multiple times, not just repeat in a loop, it's very useful because you can define it once and then simply use the name of the function to call it at any point in the program. Functions can also be used to break down a problem. For example, to break a complex problem into smaller parts and assign each part to one different function. Python even has some default functions, some of which are seen here and we actually used previously, such as the print function, which prints a value, the input function, which takes a user input, and then the string, integer, float, and bool function to convert variables and other values between different data types, the range function used in for loops to iterate through the loop, and the type function, which returns the type of an object. Now let's look at the syntax of a function. So a function is created using the def keyword, followed by its name, and then in brackets its parameters, a colon, and then on the next line and other lines indented below, you can write the code for your function. So all functions have a name, and the name can be anything following the regular naming conventions, and a function is called in the program by its name. Functions can also take arguments, for example, a string or integer, and these arguments can be used for the purpose of the function, such as an addition function might take two numbers. And you need to define all of the arguments that you wish to use. So if you want to use two arguments in your function, but have only defined one, or have defined extra and you have three arguments but are only using two, you will get an error. And each time a function is called and it requires arguments, you need to specify those arguments in the bracket separated by commas, and we'll look at this more later. Functions can also return values. For example, the sum in a function that adds two numbers could be returned so that the user can print. And the values are returned using the return keyword. Now let's look at how to create a function to add two numbers, and we'll look in more detail about how to write and call functions. Alright, so we've got our REPL here, and let's define our function first. So we use the def keyword, right, then followed by our function name. So since it's for addition, let me just call this addition, right? And then we start the bracket. Inside the bracket, we want to get our parameters or data that we'll use. So we want to take two numbers, right? So let's define a and b. And these are not variables. These are just inside the function. So this a and b just stand for some inputs when you call the function, which will remain inside the function. And we do a colon, and then simply we can just use the return keyword, because this is what our function is going to be outputting back to wherever we call it. And since it's addition, we can put this in a bracket right here, and we can just simply do a plus b, right? Now, when we want to call the function, we want to use its name, and then in the brackets add our two parameters or arguments. So let's store it in a variable first. So let's name that value, and then we can do addition and brackets. Now notice how it's yellow in Replit. That means it's recognized as that function. And now separated by commas, we can add in our values. So let's use 5 and 10, right? And then that's basically calling this addition function for 5 as A and 10 as B, right? So let's print value, and our expected output is 15, 5 plus 10. So there we go, we just defined our first function, and I hope this made sense because this is very useful and important in Python. Now that we've seen the addition function, here are also some other mathematical functions which are nearly identical with just a few key differences in the return statement, where instead of addition, it's returning subtraction, multiplication, or division. And in this way, functions can be modified and their function can be changed. Okay, so let's look at a more complicated and advanced function where we can use it to find the factorial of a number. So we'll create a function called factorial, and then we'll use a for loop to go through and actually find the factorial of that number. Alright, let's start by defining a function. Let's call it factorial. And we'll take one input value, let's call it a, which is the number we want the factorial for. Okay, so we'll create a variable called factorial, and we can make that equal to 1 for now. Then we go into a for loop for I in range 1, starting from 1 to a plus 1. So it'll stop at a, and we'll make factorial multiplied by itself. So we can use the times equal to shortcut. So we can make factorial is multiplied by itself in I. So it'll be 1 times 1, so that's 1, times 2, times 3, times 4, times 5, till we reach the number. So that's the same as the factorial we're getting, right? And then what we can do is return the factorial. Okay, so let's try to run this. Let's use value again. So let's try to print, and let's see. And there we go. We know our factorial function works. Let's try it again with maybe 3, so that'll return 6, and it's working. The random library. So Python has many different modules built in, such as the random library, and others include the turtle and mathematics module. And these modules basically contain built-in functions of Python that you can import into your code, such as the math, which involves more advanced math, such as square roots, and the turtle module, which actually allows you to draw with Python. And in the random library's case, it's used to get various values, such as random integers in a certain range, random float numbers between 0 and 1, and it can even be used to get a random choice from a list. The random library can be really useful as well for things like creating a game or any other instance when you want something randomized, such as choose a random color or a random name from a list. Now let's look at examples of the random library, and we'll look at the randint function, the random function, and the choice function. So firstly, we need to import the random library in. So we can do that by importing the specific functions. So from random, import randint, for example. Or you can just use an asterisk to import all of the functions, but it's better to list out all of the functions you want. So I'll do randint, random, and choice. Let's look at randint first. So randint picks any integer from a range. So let's give 0 and 10, so it'll print an integer between 0 and 10. Let's look at it. So this time it shows 8. Next, let's look at random. So its syntax is simply like this, random and then the 2 parentheses, and you don't need to have anything in there. It simply chooses a float number between 0 and 1. So let's run this and see. And it shows 0.64. Okay, so lastly, let's look at choice. And this basically chooses, it can choose a random value from a list. So I have a list here with 1, 2, and 3, and it will choose between those. So this time it shows 1, let's run again, and this time it shows 3. Okay, that is all for this lesson, and in the next lesson we will be looking a little more deeper into functions and practicing a little more with them.